Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Seraphim, which was an unfinished collaboration between Mamoru Oshii, who you guys probably know for directing the original Ghost in the Shell movie, for directing the Pat Labor movies, etc., and Satoshi Kon, who directed Paranoia Agent, Paprika, Tokyo Godfathers, etc. I just want to say that I'd heard many things about Seraphim before reading it, many things that are pretty negative. For example, at the end of Opus, Satoshi Kon actually referred to Seraphim as his bastard child. And I'd also heard from several other people that the story was messy, the characters uninteresting, etc. So a lot of negative perceptions going into this, so I should say my expectations weren't that high. So beyond that, let's start off with the story of Seraphim. So what is the story of Seraphim? The story of Seraphim is that on the cusp of the 21st century, a disease swept Eurasia, a disease known as Seraphim, also known as the Angel Plague, which caused people, to develop features on their back that resembled angels, which would eventually kill them, by the way. Now, understandably, people wanted to flee these countries, so refugees started moving towards the developed countries that weren't afflicted, but the developed countries, understandably, closed their borders and didn't want these people who had diseases to go in. And so the refugees had to stay in their diseased countries. The beginning of the story of Seraphim is this girl here, Sarah, and her three guardians, which are known as the Magi. Balthazar, Melchior, and Caspar. And basically they've got to transport Sarah into this, into diseased Eurasia in order to be able to find something. Now, what that something is, we're not entirely sure at the beginning of the story. But that's how the story begins. First of all, I just want to say that I completely agree with the people who say that the characters themselves are bland. For example, Sarah, who is our essentially lead character in a sense, she is a kind of an object that has to be transported, but not much beyond that. She has some kind of minor interactions, trying to interact with some, diseased people, etc., and we see that she has some supernatural properties, but beyond that, she doesn't really have much of a personality. She's an object more than anything. So she herself is a very uninteresting character. And in terms of the Magi, Balthazar, Melchior, they're not particularly interesting characters, which make the first several chapters a bit uninteresting because they're explaining some of their backgrounds, how they got the positions of the Magi. As characters, I just found them rather uninteresting. Their entire purpose is to transport her, and there isn't really much interaction beyond that, not much personality beyond that. We get some hints here and there that, significant events have happened in their past. And maybe if this series wasn't, unfinished, maybe we'd find out a lot more about their past and we'd find them much more interesting characters. But in the end, that isn't really the case. In the case of Caspar, he's a dog. He's an actual dog. And he has a decent personality in that he's the most protective of Sarah, but beyond that, there isn't too much of a thing to him. So overall, the characters themselves are pretty bland and uninteresting. What I found the most interesting about this, though, and this kind of almost saved the series for me, was the world building, the actual world it's set in. Most of this series is actually set in China, which is actually kind of broken up into a number of nations, divided up between warlords, actual working nations, paranoid nations, etc. And I found a lot of the world that it's set in really interesting. Like, for example, the southernmost nation that has been forged in China is actually forged by a real ethnic group, I should point out, called the Hakka. And I'd come across the Hakka before in the past, and I just found the ideas of that very interesting. This kind of southern nation developed for Hakka by Hakka. Now, I also found a lot of the other aspects of the world quite interesting as well. Like, for example, the disease and how the people reacted to the disease. How the actual countries responded to that, like building up zones on the borders of these diseased countries in order to keep the diseased people in. I found a lot of that interesting, and to be fair, I found it kind of sad that this really interesting world had this kind of lackluster execution and was unfinished in the end. And then I guess the last thing to point out about the story before moving on is that a lot of people like to make a big deal of the fact that Satoshi Kon was involved with this, but Satoshi Kon's biggest involvement with this was the artwork itself. There have been debates on how much involvement with the story that he, had, but overall, this is much more of a Mamoru Oshii story, and I gotta say, that is somewhat problematic in and of itself, because Mamoru Oshii has a very slow way of telling stories, which, I should say, doesn't really lend itself well to an unfinished series. A lot of build-up with not much payoff, I should say. That's a good way to describe how the story worked out. Overall, the story, not that great. The world itself, potentially very interesting, but, lackluster execution. Very slow pace for a series that didn't, have an end. So, very problematic in that regard. In terms of the artwork, Satoshi Kon was responsible for the artwork itself. And what we get is actually really some lovely, looking artwork. For example, we have these kind of artwork, very pleasant character designs. Very reminiscent of his later artwork. As we could see, he's developed a much more kind of Satoshi Kon style in comparison to some of his earlier manga work, which was very reminiscent of Katsuhiro Otomo, the creator of Akira. So I really adore Satoshi Kon's artwork, and because of that, I found the art of this series very pleasant. The paneling itself is a bit on the bland side, but that's pretty fine. And I should also point out we have some really lovely color pages. I love the look of these color pages. I think they look absolutely fantastic. So I wish there was a bit more than that. There is very little color in this series. In fact, I think there might only be 4 pages of color. But I just gotta say that I loved the actual way the series itself was colored. Now, in terms of the way Dark Horse has released this, this is the most notable aspect of it. So let's first of all start with the trim size. So if I get my trusty Yotsuba, we can see that Seraphim is much bigger than Yotsuba, which allows the artwork to breathe, which is very pleasant. As I pointed out, there is color pages in this, which is very nice. We also have a bit written about Seraphim by Takashi Watanabe. Takashi Watanabe was a guy basically involved on the publishing side of Seraphim, kind of explaining how the series ended, how it started, kind of the how it was compiled, because it wasn't compiled until after Satoshi Kon's death. So he kind of explained that. Then we get a bit of character concepts, like for example these, just showing some of the character designs, how they could have potentially gone, etc., etc. But the biggest deal, and this is a huge deal, I should say, is we have a afterword to the English language edition by Carl Gustav Horn, who is the guy basically in charge of the manga section in Dark Horse. He writes a 20-page comprehensive essay on the history of Seraphim, the workings of the mangaka themselves, Mamoru Oshii and Satoshi Kon, the history in regards to that. For example, in particular, China. How China was broken up in the past, the people involved in, this new world. For example, there's actually some real people, some real Chinese generals and politicians mentioned in Seraphim, and he kind of explains why they were mentioned, why, how their involvement might have been, etc., etc. I found the essay itself really, really interesting. So, I gotta say, of the high, basically the high point, I think, of this work was to read that essay. It was very comprehensive, really informative, and very interesting. So, overall, Seraphim, what do I think of it? I think as a story itself, it's very flawed. The characters themselves aren't that interesting. We have a potentially interesting world that isn't really developed too much because of the fact it was unfinished. And we have this slow-burning style of Mamoru Oshii, which generally works pretty well with a lot of his movies, but it certainly doesn't work well here, particularly due to the fact that it's very slow-burning and it's unfinished. So we have a lot of kind of build-up with very little payoff. Now the artwork, as I said, very pleasant, but the main deal that you should get this is that essay written by Carl Gustav Horn, which I found really, really interesting and informative. So yeah, overall, would I recommend this? If you're into Satoshi Kon or Mamoru Oshii, you really do need to pick this up, simply because it's an important work by them. If you're interested in this as a story, I have to say, probably don't pick this up. This really isn't that gratifying of a story. As I said, lots of build-up, no payoff. If you're interested in, an essay written about, Mamoru Oshii, about Satoshi Kon, about the world that's been potentially set up in Seraphim, etc., etc., that would be another great reason to pick this up as well. It's 20 pages as well, and it took me, I'd say, about as long to read as it actually took me to read the manga. So, very good value in that case. So those are my thoughts on Seraphim. Don't pick this up if you're only interested in its story, but if you're interested in the mangaka themselves, in the essay of this, definitely do pick this up. So that was my review of Seraphim. Hopefully you found it informative and entertaining. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.